thinking I was gonna go to bed, and then I figured, oh, I need to say the thing, and then I was like, oh no, I forgot the thing. I need to actually sit here and remember what it is. Oh yeah. You know, if you teach people to do for themselves, this is the difference between Republican and Democratic values. It's not rich, poor, it is literally Republican. Teach them to do it themselves. Democratic. Here, let me do it for you. And have all the power in this relationship. The politicians are just out for themselves in general. But this is the difference between the ideals. A Republican is, the government can't be trusted with that kind of power. That's what a conservative is. The government shouldn't have this power because they can't be trusted with it. That's why we have, the laws that we do about government, and that's actually supposed to limit their power, but politicians have sort of fucked that over. Currently. I still don't see Trump draining the freaking swamp, as he puts it. I think he just said that because he knows people want him to do that. But he's really more focused on just giving his buddies tax breaks and stuff, and not actually paying attention to the crap that goes on in this country. He does realize that this is only 1% of the population that lives like this, right? That he is actually less than 1%. He is, insanely fucking rich, okay? Insane. And he's probably, in 1% of the population of the world. Most of us aren't like that. We're not rich. In fact, most Americans don't even have the money to travel out of the country. That's not a big percentage of people. I have never stepped foot anywhere outside the country. I've only seen footage of it. I've never stepped foot outside the country. I don't have the money to do that shit. I mean, maybe I'd like to, but also maybe I'd not like to deal with the bullshit that comes with it. But also maybe I don't know, never been on a plane. Yeah, I can say a lot of things like that. My grandfather used to take me places, though, whenever I was little, before the accident. My grandmother didn't really like traveling even then. Usually he was the one explaining things to me. So, even whenever I was little and my memory hadn't really, I hadn't developed enough to perceive every little detail around me, it's different like that. I don't actually remember a lot of my grandmother during that time because you remember who you interact with. My grandmother wasn't interacting, she was just sort of there. My grandfather was the one who would sit there and explain things to me. If my grandmother interacted with me, it was usually to scold me for existing. Occasionally, it was for something you should actually be maybe scolded for. Occasionally. Mostly it was just, though, telling me that I was an idealistic child. How dare I? How dare I be a child? No, she actually did used to scold me for being what she called idealistic, which really was, but it's also natural for a child to not really know all that much about the world and be idealistic. And, whenever I was a kid, I would always try and figure out, is this person really guilty of doing this thing? So my grandparents, like, the news was pretty much what was on. If I wanted to spend any time with my grandmother, I had to watch TV. Wasn't really quality time. But I used to do it so that I could even be in the same room with her without her saying cruel things. So that was like the only way that was going to happen. So I used to like lay there on the floor because I wasn't allowed to sit on the couch. Even as a teenager, I was not allowed to sit on the couch. My grandmother, like, after she didn't have any more excuses, she just sort of piled a bunch of stuff in the middle of the couch. Like, my grandfather wasn't even sitting, like, next to her. They were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. And she would just pile, like, stuff in the middle. And then say that there was no room. My grandmother was a bitch. So, she was mean. She was mean personified. And, you know, my grandfather would sit there and say, you know, your grandmother really loves you. And I would say, no, she doesn't. And I still say today, no, she really didn't. My grandmother resented my very existence, and every moment that we were even in the same room, she kind of just wanted me to disappear or die. And she wasn't shy about this. She told me that a lot, too. Like, basically, the better twin died. You both should have died. If either one of you lived through what happened, it should have been your sister. And then, you know, and not even talking about my little sister, like, most of them don't even know that, like, that was even a thing. Like, I had to, like, verify with my mom whenever I was little. Like, I was having dreams and shit. And my mom was actually never going to tell me. And then my grandmother fucked my shit up. Like, sometimes she would reference the twin, and sometimes she would be like, you didn't have a twin. And sometimes she would be like, the better twin died. And other times she would be like, you know, actually, that one doesn't get better. That one just goes straight down shit's creek without a paddle. That one doesn't get better and doesn't really parody itself or be any sort of irony. Sometimes it was like, the better twin died, or it was just like, you should go die. You know, why don't you just go kill yourself? And she would even detail how. Like, there's a point, you know, she'd yelled at me that I heard demons and all this so many times that I actually went to the doctor and, under her threat of grandma, told them. I think it was like 9? Yeah, my grandmother actually sat there. It took like half a dozen doctors, because this guy didn't even believe it at first, because my grandmother had been insisting it and insisting it and insisting it, and I'd been saying no, and I was basically told that, yeah. So, I didn't actually hear demons, and the doctor was kind of skeptical about it, and he would not send my grandparents out of the room to ask me, so I couldn't tell him the truth. I was literally being punished for telling the truth. My grandmother really would do those things to me, and all the things that I said that the demon said were actually things that she'd said. Yeah. And you say something like that once, and it'll crop up again later. It'll keep on happening. It didn't come back to haunt me as an adult like that, necessarily, so much as the fact that it had been there. And my grandmother, well, it was mostly that my grandmother kept on insisting on this crap. But yeah, there was one time when I was 9. And I'd previously stood by, you know, that there was nothing else there, just And I'd actually had to have, like, one doctor specify that something wasn't seeing or hearing something because, a voice inside your head is just you. You're thinking things, and sometimes you're thinking, like, it's a voice, and it's just yours. It's just your inner voice. I actually had to have someone, because my grandmother had actually confused me at that point. Like, someone, because I was just wondering if this, because my grandmother kept on saying that I was crazy. So I must be crazy, right? And, that was, anyways, I'd barely lost my mom at that point. And my grandmother was already taking me and insisting that I was cuckoo. I was nuttier than a squirrel's stash. And more cuckoo than a cuckoo clock. I don't know. Just. And the state had already done that, so, like. And then they'll listen whenever you say that, even if there's, like, doubt about whether or not you're telling the truth in that situation. They knew. I think they knew. But whenever you tell them later that that happened, nobody wants to listen to you. It is a fight. It is a fight, even in adulthood, like years and years later. That just. But yeah, whenever I was 8 years old, no, 9, I was probably like, no, I was around 9, I think. Either about to turn 9 or. It actually was not in a timeline that long after the other incident where someone had actually had to tell me that a voice in your head that is you is just you. It's okay and it's normal. I actually had to be told this because, someone tells you that you're crazy enough and you start to believe it. And I just lost my mom, and I'd already, like, been through CPS custody as a kid. They tried to use, they were using, the whole, oh, we're gonna declare that she's sick. Before they did that, I had no need for any of the shit. Like, I was pretty healthy, other than, like, some medical problems that were being dealt with. I didn't need any behavioral help. My mom never had to do anything like that. I was fairly well-grounded, well-behaved. Yeah, I did normal kid stuff, but that was all I did. Normal kid stuff. And then they were in my life. And then my grandmother used that and kept on insisting. It's funny how much power someone else can have, insisting on something like that. She already had me on medications because she kept on insisting this. Like, she'd already found someone to listen, and this doctor had, kind of stepped that back and said, I'm not doing this until I hear it from her. You can tell me all you want, but she's saying that she doesn't hear anything. She doesn't see anything. Everything. And my grandmother just kept on going and going and going. I think there was a point that it actually came out and I tried to tell him. But nobody was listening to me. Nonetheless, I told them what they wanted to hear, and I guess that was what he wanted to hear. My grandmother made me sick. And she held all the power in that relationship. I was 9. looking back, I feel like, wow, this was totally my fault in that respect. But it also wasn't, because I was 9. So I actually have to like rationally think about it and say, this wasn't my fault because I was 9. Literally, my grandmother threatened to hurt people that I cared about. She threatened the dog, and she said that things would happen to my little brother who'd been taken back east and all this different stuff. And I had no reason not to believe her. In fact, I had every reason to believe her because my grandmother actually had done things that hurt people. She had influenced the people around me so that people would get hurt. She had gotten my mom fired from work, which she would later do to me whenever I was an adult with my first job. She had influenced the people around my mom. She had done her best to do that. And she had created a lot of the situations that she used to glorify herself with. My grandmother was evil, okay? And she did these things. And not only did I have no reason to think that she couldn't do these things, I had every reason to think that she could. And I was 9. Your one friend left in the world, or the lie grandma wants you to tell. Because that dog was my one friend left in the world. Everything else had been stripped from me. My best friend at school? What best friend? I'd been ripped out of that school. It had disrupted everything. She moved on. And whenever I went back, nothing was the same, but I was different. And none of them knew how to deal with me. I wasn't a shiny new student, but I wasn't the same student that had left either. I was, but I wasn't. And everybody just felt like it was actually strangely even more isolating. And then I went through the whole changing schools all the time thing, that they changed the program so that Chris was going to have to go through this if we didn't switch to homeschool. His dad still needs to take the letter in. I'm going to remind him. Because we can't have this taking too long. So, Chris is already doing school at home. But typically speaking, you don't do this in the middle of the year. But we're moving, and we don't want him to have to go through yet another adjustment. With that on top of it, like, he doesn't handle... It would be better for everyone. Especially Chris. So... yeah, that was the one point in my life I actually said something like that. And it was completely under duress. And I was 9. And that's what I said. I said that demons were speaking to me and telling me to kill myself. And saying all these other mean things. My grandmother was literally standing there encouraging me. She was actually mouthing things to me at one point, whenever the doctor looked away. That was some heavy level coaching. Like, I wasn't just saying things that she'd said to me. At some points, I was being told what to say. my grandmother was absolutely vile. And what the hell was I supposed to do about it? I was 9. And it's still horrifying looking back. Because that doctor actually refused. Because, this just didn't seem right. I was actually saying, I want to talk to you without my grandmother in the room. That's not really normal. At least I don't think it is. I mean, the whole reason I wanted to is because they weren't talking to me. And there was so many doctors didn't even try to talk to me. They just talked over me to my grandmother, who told them all these things that weren't true. And I would end up on all these medications. I don't even know how many diagnoses I had growing up. I had so many of them. Some, the doctors knew, and there was a point in my life I had diagnosis as long as they needed someone for a medical trial, and then they would acknowledge that I didn't have it. Everybody's always writing a book. That was that perception that I got of the world. Everybody's always writing a book. And they don't really care who they hurt doing it. That is the only time in my life I have ever actually said to someone, you know what, I see and hear things that aren't there, sort of thing. Except my grandmother was literally looming right there, making sure that I did it. And I was 9. And I'm sure that if my relatives ever got a hold of that information, it would suddenly become one more reason why I utterly deserved everything that happened from that. All the way into adulthood. You don't realize this, but things like that, they're like dominoes. Sometimes things like that, they lead. And it just keeps getting bigger and bigger until it just sweeps you away. This wasn't even something that I did because I wanted to. That dog was... She was the only thing I had left. Queenie was... Foxy wasn't around yet. Queenie was still alive. At that point, that dog was actually 18 years old whenever she died. Yeah. I think I was no, I wasn't quite in high school yet. I was still in elementary school, so I think I was in 6th grade? It was maybe a year or two later that she died, but at that point my grandmother had said that this was right after my mom died. She said that if I didn't do it, she would take Queenie in and have her put down. I had just lost my mother. Queenie was blind because she was so old. She was mostly blind. She could see enough that if you put tape on the door, she wouldn't run into it. She was old. Her eyes were going. They were on their way out, and she would later be completely blind. But looking at that from 9-year-old me's point of view, that dog was the only thing still around. I'd known that dog since I was little. There were times my mom had taken care of that dog. I'd known that dog since I was born. I'd lost my parents. My siblings had been ripped away from me. Even my hair was different. Nothing that made me me. Was still around. Except that dog. And while I couldn't articulate that at 9. All I knew was that that dog was the single most important thing I had left. My grandfather would go along with whatever my grandmother did. My grandmother existed for herself. I had no one, except for that dog. So whenever I was given a choice, I chose the dog. I was 9. I didn't know, and I didn't even understand the significance of doing so, or even remotely what it could cause. All I knew was that my grandmother wanted me to pretend to be sick, which wasn't even strange. Not whenever dealing with her. She did that shit all the time. Just not usually that extreme. But I was getting to the age that I could say no. And I was saying no. And she couldn't have that. So I was 9, and that dog was really important to me. I know I usually talk about Foxy, but Foxy came later and was also leverage in a lot of fucked up situations. Once I told my grandfather that she threatened the dog, and he said that she would never hurt the dog. I said it didn't matter. Whenever I finally told him that, though, we'd already had Foxy, it's like he didn't even understand. I tried telling him earlier on that I said what I was told to say, but that was the lie. And he didn't understand. I don't even think he was listening. That was earlier on, whenever I still entertained the idea that somebody would listen. After a while, you just stop. You just drown in it. Where everybody seems to want you to. People are so determined to believe that you're sick. Some of those people will even carry that into adulthood. They just can't accept that this happened and that they were in any way part of it. That their lack of presence as family could have even contributed to it. They don't want to face that. You have to be the scapegoat to them at that point. When does it end? I was 9. I can't go back and change shit. And even then, this stuff would have probably happened even without that. It wasn't really taken seriously because I'm sure there were many signs. But there were others that didn't care. They don't care. They just care about what they can do and what they can get away with doing, and that actually was something that I'd faced even before that. I didn't want somebody sitting in the room talking for me, and that's what was going to happen with my grandmother in the room. There was also the fact that if I said something that she didn't approve first, I was going to have the shit beat out of me. I literally, could not talk with her in the room. I couldn't say anything. So I needed her out of the room. I wasn't going to tell them about her. I was just going to tell them that I wasn't fucking crazy. Just not in those words. Because I was a kid, and all I wanted to tell them was that I didn't see or hear things, and I wanted it to stop. Because some of the medications that they put me on did make me see and hear things. And it was terrifying. And it did things to me over the years, and because even whenever I'd start to get somebody to listen, to kind of say, wait a minute, my grandmother would just swoop in and, nope, gotta keep the illusion up. I went through so many different diagnoses growing up. I couldn't tell you all the shit that I was on. Some of it I was on very short periods of time. It fucked up my health, and to be perfectly honest, they'd done this even before that. Like, I was already being put on meds that made me really out of it. Like, I was a zombie. I was a kid zombie. I wasn't bouncing around like would have been normal for me. I wasn't climbing trees, which would have been normal for me. I wasn't doing anything that was normal for me, except maybe drawing. I wasn't me. I was a medication zombie already, and I would try to tell them, and it's not like I could tell them, hey, the medications are what's making me like this. I didn't understand. I had my grandmother telling me that it was me, and then the medications were making me this way. So you think that you're just getting worse, but in reality, you're just a human being with feelings, and you're just a kid. I wasn't supposed to be able to know what was even happening to me. But the reality is that life is not fair. And it was less than fair. It was less than not fair in those moments. And that's not even abnormal. Later, even just going to therapy and talking about the fact that I'd been used in medical trials, and there were, which basically is experiments. Medical trials are experiments, whether you want to call it that or not. So whenever I was a kid, I was fairly adept at vocabulary, even medicated out the ass. So I used the word experiment. And I told a therapist that I felt like I was under a microscope, and that they were just putting stuff on me to see what would happen. That I wasn't even a person. That I didn't say not even the words that I used as a kid were, but this is what I was telling them. And I can look back and I can know what I was trying to tell them. Because I can identify all these feelings that I was developmentally just not old enough to even articulate half of. Because you're not processed. You're not old enough to even process this shit. The state had already done it. Whenever they'd started me in this shit whenever I was 6. Their arguments were basically they did it so that they could put me on a bunch of medication to try and medicate wanting to go home out of me. And they actually weren't shy about this. So, somebody actually said something to that effect. You'd be surprised what people will say whenever they think that they have a free pass to do anything that they want. That is literally how I got into that stuff. I was taken into state custody. I was separated from my little brother. My little sister hadn't been born yet. And whenever my mom got us back, and she needed, like, so much support to do that. There was a community of people behind my mom making them behave, and this was before they got, and my mom wasn't even the reason we were taken. Yeah. So, and even she needed a community behind her to make them behave whenever they didn't want to behave. And this was before Clinton signed that bill that made things worse by basically putting a bounty on every kid's head, which is exactly what it felt like as a child, and exactly what it looks like as an adult who understands how that actually works in practice. I don't get to have that idealistic view people have of, wow, this must work the way that it should because that's how it's supposed to. No, I've been there. I've seen it. I've been the kid in it. I know it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. I've also been the adult that it said, oh wow, this is a risk factor because you were at some point in your life in CPS custody, therefore you are more likely to actually be someone that does this stuff. So yay, this is something that we're gonna say is a reason we're doing this. People are fucked up people whenever they do stuff like that, but that's the thing, they'll look at you and they'll say that it's you. But it's really them. The only part I played in that was whenever I was 9. And I did what I was told. With heavy threat over my head, because I kept on refusing to. That was why she resorted to threats, because this doctor didn't want to listen to her. He wanted me to speak, which didn't happen very much. Not before and not after. I actually didn't even run into that again until I was an adult. There's a lot of people, countless people, who are perfectly willing to listen to everybody but you. You can be accused of being a nutter. Nuttier than a squirrel stash. And nobody will listen to you. But they'll listen to the people accusing you of being nuttier than a squirrel stash. Your thoughts are automatically invalidated simply for existing at that point. But that is the only time in my life I've ever gone in and said, yeah, I see and hear things that aren't there. And I didn't even use those words. So I was 9. But I don't really want to go into exact wordings. That's basically what it was. Actually, that's kind of close. Sorry, I was thinking about it. I mean, there were more words, but that actually almost does match one. No, it doesn't match it exactly, but the general structure of the sentence. Sorry, I was thinking. I wasn't medicated enough at that point that I didn't lose lucidity until after that. There were points I still can't remember, not because of trauma, though there are those too, and I have mostly gotten that back, I think. I know that there's probably more, but yeah, you can actually lose memory during times of trauma. So sometimes your mind sort of shuts down because it's too much. This is actually a normal part of the human mind. It's normal in extreme situations. This is definitely extreme. I was isolated, heavily abused, neglected, and I was on a shit ton of medications that I had no business being on. Yes. And yes, my grandmother did neglect me and abuse me.